Sudan sits at the meeting point of worlds: Arab and African, Muslim and Christian, desert and river. A nation the size of Western Europe, stretched across deserts, savannas, and the fertile Nile Valley. To outsiders, it is often a place of headlines: war, famine, division. But Sudan's story is far older and far richer than its present wounds. For centuries, it was ruled from outside, first by pharaohs, then by Ottomans, later by the British and Egyptians together. Each left behind borders, divisions, and unfinished business. In 1956, Sudan finally won its independence. Crowds poured into the streets of Khartoum, waving flags and chanting for freedom. But beneath the celebration was fragility. The new state was enormous, divided into more than 500 ethnic groups and dozens of faith traditions. The north was dominated by Arab Muslims tied to the Nile Valley. The south was home to Christians and animist groups. The west, in Darfur and Kordofan, carried its own long history of marginalization. The new government was weak, struggling to balance these competing identities. Within 3 years, chaos had returned. By 1958, the first military coup toppled Sudan's elected leaders, the beginning of a pattern that would repeat more than 20 times in the decades to come. Civil wars soon followed. The First Sudanese Civil War, 1955 to 1972, pitted southern rebels against Khartoum's Arab elite, leaving 500,000 dead before a fragile peace. That peace collapsed in 1983 when President Jafar Nimeri tried to impose Islamic law nationwide. The Second Civil War raged for 22 years, killing an estimated 2 million people and displacing millions more. Out of this firestorm, a new leader emerged: Omar al-Bashir. A military officer, he seized power in 1989 and ruled for 3 decades. His reign became synonymous with dictatorship, corruption, and brutality. Bashir abolished political freedoms, aligned Sudan with Islamist movements, and plunged the country deeper into isolation. But his most infamous legacy was Darfur. In 2003, rebel groups in the western region rose up, demanding equality. Bashir responded by arming Arab militias known as the Janjaweed. Villages were burned, women raped, entire communities wiped out. The world called it genocide. By 2020, more than 300,000 people had been killed in Darfur and 3 million displaced. Bashir became the first sitting head of state, indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. It was from the Janjaweed that one man rose to prominence: Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, nicknamed Hemedti. A former camel trader from Darfur, he commanded Janjaweed fighters with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. In 2013, he rebranded them as the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, gaining official recognition and funding from Khartoum. Meanwhile, Sudan itself was splitting apart. The Second Civil War ended with a peace deal that granted the South a referendum. In 2011, the world's newest country was born: South Sudan. Its independence was celebrated, but for Sudan, it meant losing 3/4 of its oil reserves, the backbone of its economy. Bashir clung to power despite sanctions, economic collapse, and international isolation. But in 2019, after months of protests, even the army abandoned him. Bashir was toppled, ending 30 years of rule. In his place rose a fragile coalition of soldiers and civilians, promising a transition to democracy. At its head stood 2 men: General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, commander of the Sudanese armed forces, and Hemedti, head of the RSF. For a brief moment, Sudan seemed poised for change. Crowds in Khartoum chanted for freedom, peace, justice. The generals promised elections, but behind closed doors, they maneuvered for control. By 2021, the military staged another coup, dissolving the civilian partnership. Sudan was once again ruled by generals, and beneath the surface, the rivalry between Burhan and Hemedti was turning deadly. The uneasy alliance between Sudan's two most powerful men, Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hemedti of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, was always temporary. The question was not if it would break, but when. By early 2023, the fuse was already lit. The dispute centered on one issue: the future of the RSF. Burhan insisted that Hemedti's fighters, tens of thousands of men armed, paid, and loyal to him, must be folded into the army within 2 years. For Burhan, it was a matter of survival. A parallel army could not be tolerated. But for Hemedti, integration meant losing everything. He demanded a 10-year process, time enough to cement his power, protect his networks, and position himself as Sudan's next leader. Talks broke down. Suspicion hardened. And in Khartoum, ordinary people began noticing ominous signs. Military checkpoints appearing where there had been none, RSF convoys arriving on the outskirts of the city, army units reinforcing their barracks. Rumors whispered through the markets: the generals are about to fight. Just after dawn on April 15, 2023, Khartoum woke to the sound of gunfire. The RSF had struck first. Their fighters moved fast, thousands pouring into the capital in pickup trucks mounted with machine guns, rocket launchers welded to their backs. Within hours, they had seized critical sites: Khartoum International Airport, where civilians waiting to board flights scattered as gunfire ripped across the tarmac and a passenger plane was hit and set ablaze. State TV headquarters, where RSF fighters stormed the broadcaster, silencing government voices and declaring their own. Control of the airwaves meant control of the story. And the presidential palace, which RSF units claimed to have taken, though fierce battles raged around its gates. For many in Khartoum, it felt like a coup in motion. For a moment, the RSF seemed unstoppable. But the Sudanese armed forces were not idle. Burhan ordered the skies unleashed. Fighter jets roared overhead, dropping bombs on RSF convoys. Helicopter gunships strafed neighborhoods, their machine guns cutting across streets. Artillery batteries opened up from bases around Khartoum, their shells shaking windows miles away. The RSF had mobility. The army had firepower. And the battleground was not a remote desert or a rural plain. It was a city of millions. By midday, Khartoum had become a war zone. Black smoke rose from the airport and city center. Bridges across the Nile were contested, tanks positioned on one side, technicals on the other. Streets once filled with taxis and minibuses were now eerily empty, littered with burned-out cars. For civilians, there was no escape. Families huddled in their apartments as walls shook with explosions. Mothers held children in bathrooms, the innermost rooms, hoping they'd be safer there. Hospitals overflowed, surgeons working by flashlight when the power failed. Doctors described performing amputations with no anesthesia. A teacher recalled guiding students across a bridge under sniper fire. We told them not to look back, just to keep moving, but the sound of bullets was everywhere. The RSF entrenched themselves in civilian neighborhoods, using schools, mosques, and homes as bases. The army responded with airstrikes, turning entire blocks into rubble. The death toll mounted, though no one could keep count. Burhan and Hemedti had once stood side by side after ousting Omar al-Bashir in 2019, promising to protect Sudan's revolution. They had shaken hands before cameras, sworn to guide the nation to democracy, but those promises had long since curdled. On April 15, 2023, their partnership ended in smoke and blood. Neither side won the day. The RSF held the airport, parts of the palace, and state TV. The SAF held its headquarters, its barracks, and the skies. One truth became undeniable. This would not be a quick clash. It was the beginning of a new civil war, one that would not just decide Sudan's future, but threaten to unravel the region itself. If April 15th was the spark, the weeks that followed were the firestorm. The rapid support forces capitalized on their momentum. Unlike the army, they were not burdened by bureaucracy or heavy armor. Their strength lay in mobility. Columns of pickup trucks, technicals, roaring down highways, men bristling with machine guns, rocket launchers welded to flatbeds, fighters with decades of experience in desert warfare. Their first real gains came in Darfur, the region where Hemedti and many of his men were born. For Darfuris, the RSF were no strangers. They were the Janjaweed reborn. Villages that had once suffered under Janjaweed raids now saw those same militias, rebranded and reinforced, marching under a new banner. In Nyala, capital of South Darfur, RSF fighters stormed army barracks and police stations, raising their flag over government buildings. El Geneina in West Darfur descended into horror as clashes spiraled into ethnic massacres. Reports told of RSF fighters targeting Masalit communities, torching neighborhoods, killing men, and assaulting women. Aid agencies called it a continuation of the Darfur genocide. 20 years later, with the same perpetrators. For Hemedti, Darfur was not just home, it was a fortress. The RSF established command centers across the region, tapping into old networks of loyalty and fear. From Darfur, they funneled resources eastward toward Sudan's heartland. Darfur also provided something else: gold. The RSF controlled Sudan's most lucrative gold mines, especially in Jebel Amer. For years, Hemedti's family had built a financial empire exporting gold to Dubai and beyond. Now those revenues became a war chest. Gold was smuggled out on cargo planes, sometimes through Chad, sometimes directly to the Gulf. In return came weapons, ammunition, and cash. Western intelligence agencies accused the United Arab Emirates of bankrolling the RSF through these networks. Russia's Wagner Group was also reported to have cut deals, supplying weapons and expertise in exchange for access to Sudan's gold. Every shipment of bullion meant more bullets in RSF rifles. From Darfur, RSF forces surged east into Kordofan. The prize was El Obeid, a key commercial hub and crossroads. Controlling it meant choking the army's ability to move supplies between Khartoum and the west. RSF fighters besieged the city, cutting roads, ambushing convoys, and striking fear into surrounding villages. Farmers fled their fields, markets emptied, and the economy of the region collapsed almost overnight. Then came the boldest move yet: Gezira State, the breadbasket of Sudan. For over a century, the Gezira irrigation scheme, canals stretching from the Blue Nile, had fed the country. Its fertile fields produced sorghum, wheat, and cotton. Whoever controlled Gezira controlled Sudan's stomach. In late 2023, RSF fighters swept into Wad Madani, Gezira's capital. The city fell within days. Videos showed RSF soldiers parading through streets, once filled with university students and traders. Warehouses were looted, irrigation pumps destroyed, silos burned. The fall of Wad Madani was catastrophic. Suddenly, millions who had fled Khartoum were displaced again. Farmers abandoned fields, leaving crops to rot. Families who once sent food to the capital now scavenged for scraps. Aid groups called it the death of Sudan's breadbasket. Inside Khartoum, the RSF burrowed deeper. They set up bases in schools and hospitals, knowing airstrikes would hesitate to target them. In Omdurman, they dug trenches along main roads. In Khartoum North, they seized factories and fuel depots, turning industrial areas into fortresses. The army's counterstrikes devastated neighborhoods. Apartment blocks collapsed into rubble, leaving civilians crushed beneath. RSF fighters used terrified families as shields, daring the army to fire. The capital was no longer just a battlefield, it was a hostage. Hemedti portrayed himself as Sudan's liberator. His speeches, broadcast on seized TV stations and social media, cast him as the voice of the marginalized, Darfuris, rural tribes, the neglected. He promised democracy, justice, and dignity. But on the ground, the reality was different. Witnesses described RSF units looting homes, assaulting civilians, and committing atrocities in Darfur and Khartoum alike. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch accused them of mass killings, ethnic targeting, and widespread sexual violence. Hemedti was no freedom fighter. He was an opportunist, using the language of justice to mask the brutality of his campaign. By the end of 2023, it seemed the RSF had the upper hand. They controlled much of Darfur, parts of Kordofan, Gezira's breadbasket, and most of Khartoum's streets. The army appeared cornered, battered, outmaneuvered, bleeding legitimacy. For a moment, the possibility loomed that Hemedti could topple Burhan and seize power entirely. But the SAF still had one weapon left: time. For much of 2023, it looked like the Sudanese armed forces might collapse under the RSF's onslaught. But the army, though battered, outmaneuvered, and slow, had not been broken. Its strategy was brutal in its simplicity: survive, hold the strongholds, and buy time until the tide could turn. 3 fortified positions inside Khartoum never fell. The Army General Command, the nerve center of Burhan's forces, the Armored Corps base bristling with aging tanks and heavy artillery, and the Military Academy, where officer cadets and trapped soldiers dug trenches and prepared for siege. Cut off from the outside world, these garrisons endured months of encirclement. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition was rationed bullet by bullet. Food was reduced to meager portions of rice and bread, dropped by parachute in dangerous nighttime airdrops. For civilians in Khartoum, the persistence of these army islands was both hope and curse. Their resistance tied down RSF forces, but it also guaranteed more bombardments. Neighborhoods around the strongholds became wastelands, homes reduced to rubble in the crossfire. Yet against all odds, these bastions held. Their survival became symbolic. The SAF was bloodied, but not broken. As Khartoum burned, Burhan moved east. Port Sudan, a Red Sea city long known as the country's trade lifeline, became the new seat of government. From there, the SAF built a shadow state. Ministries reopened in temporary offices. Foreign embassies shifted operations to the coast. Cargo ships unloaded desperately needed fuel, grain, and, quietly, weapons. Port Sudan became Sudan's only real link to the outside world. Diplomats flew in to negotiate, aid agencies coordinated relief, and Burhan's generals worked the phones, rallying support from allies abroad. The city's population swelled as refugees poured in from central Sudan. Hotels turned into barracks, schools into shelters. It was chaotic, but compared to Khartoum's smoking ruins, Port Sudan felt like the last safe harbor of the state. The SAF's endurance depended on foreign lifelines. Egypt, Burhan's northern neighbor and longtime ally, provided training, intelligence, and, according to some reports, covert air support. Cairo's motive was clear. Stability on the Nile was existential. Eritrea, across the eastern border, opened its territory for training camps, supplying fighters to reinforce Burhan's ranks. Ethiopia, still fragile after its own Tigray conflict, permitted mercenaries and supplies to flow into Sudan, fearing the war's spillover. Iran re-emerged as a key backer, sending its infamous Shahed drones in exchange for a foothold on the Red Sea. Turkey sold Bayraktar drones, adding precision to the army's once blind artillery. Russia, initially sympathetic to Hemedti through Wagner's gold ties, shifted toward Burhan, tempted by offers of a naval base on the Red Sea and wary of Hemedti's dependence on Western-sanctioned smuggling networks. Each foreign player had its own reasons: Red Sea access, Nile stability, gold, or geopolitical influence. But together, they gave the SAF a fighting chance. The arrival of drones was a turning point. Sudan's air force was old, its MiG jets relics from the 1980s, its tanks and howitzers dating back to the Second World War. Against the RSF's mobility, these heavy weapons were often clumsy, but drones changed the battlefield. From Port Sudan, drone operators began guiding artillery with pinpoint accuracy, striking RSF convoys hidden among villages. Surveillance drones mapped Khartoum's urban labyrinth, exposing RSF positions dug into residential blocks. Later, Iranian and Turkish strike drones carried out the attacks themselves, blasting RSF depots and fuel stores with precision the SAF had never known. For the first time since April 2023, the RSF found themselves on the defensive. By late 2024, the SAF began reclaiming ground. In the south, they retook Wad Madani, cutting off the RSF from Gezira's fertile fields. In Khartoum, coordinated strikes broke through RSF barricades. Soldiers from besieged garrisons linked up with reinforcements, their survival a symbol of army resilience. In Darfur, SAF offensives pressed into RSF-held towns, while El Fasher, still in government hands, became both fortress and humanitarian catastrophe. Progress was slow, costly, and uneven, but it was progress. The RSF had expanded quickly, burning fuel and goodwill in equal measure. The SAF, though plodding and often brutal, had time, foreign backers, and the machinery of the state. By early 2025, the balance of power was shifting. The army, once humiliated and cornered, was regrouping into a force capable not just of survival, but of counterattack. Every civil war is also a mirror. Look closely enough, and you see not just the fighters in the streets, but the foreign capitals pulling strings behind them. Sudan is no exception. No outside actor has been more controversial than the United Arab Emirates. For years, Dubai was the hub through which Hemedti's gold empire flowed. Bars smelted in Darfur, flown to the Gulf, and sold into the global market. In return came weapons, cash, and political cover. Investigations by the UN and independent watchdogs have tied the UAE to the RSF's ability to sustain its war machine. Emirati officials deny it. They frame their role as humanitarian and diplomatic. But Sudanese officials accuse Abu Dhabi of enabling atrocities, pointing to cargo flights filled not with food, but with drones, rifles, and ammunition. The controversy grew so severe that in 2024, Sudan filed a case at the International Court of Justice, accusing the UAE of violating the Genocide Convention by arming the RSF. The ICJ dismissed it on technical grounds. The UAE had reserved itself from such disputes, but the symbolism was powerful. Khartoum had effectively named Abu Dhabi as an enemy state. If the UAE is the RSF's lifeline, Egypt has been the SAF's anchor. Cairo views Sudan as inseparable from its own security. The Nile, after all, flows through both nations. Instability in Khartoum threatens Cairo's water, trade, and southern flank. From the earliest days of the war, Egyptian pilots, intelligence officers, and trainers quietly bolstered the Sudanese army. Egyptian officials rarely advertise this role, but satellite imagery, eyewitness accounts, and SAF statements point to Cairo's fingerprints on the counteroffensive. The list does not end there. Iran, seeking a foothold on the Red Sea, provided the SAF with Shahed drones that now patrol Sudan's skies. Turkey sold Bayraktar drones, adding technological muscle to an army still reliant on Soviet-era equipment. Russia, once tied to Hemedti's Wagner-linked gold exports, shifted toward Burhan after being promised a Red Sea naval base. Saudi Arabia and the US, together with Egypt and the UAE, floated Quad peace initiatives, humanitarian pauses, civilian transitions, but these efforts often fell flat, lacking teeth and consequences. What emerges is less a civil war than a proxy battlefield, where foreign agendas are written in Sudanese blood. By late 2024, these foreign inputs tipped the scales. The SAF, long derided as sluggish and demoralized, began clawing back terrain. In Gezira, the army retook Wad Madani, reopening the breadbasket of Sudan. In Khartoum, months of drone strikes and artillery softened RSF positions, allowing the SAF to push block by block. In Darfur, RSF fighters, once emboldened by gold wealth, and Gulf backers found themselves overstretched, holding towns in name only. The war was far from over, but the RSF's rapid rise had slowed. Their blitzkrieg had burned itself out, yet victory, if it comes, will not belong solely to Sudanese hands. Every drone in the sky, every bullet in a soldier's rifle, every shipment of fuel offloaded at Port Sudan carries a foreign signature. Burhan owes Cairo. Hemedti owes Abu Dhabi. Both have been reshaped by Tehran, Ankara, Moscow, Riyadh, and Washington. And herein lies the tragedy. Sudan's sovereignty is not just under siege from its own militias. It is mortgaged to outsiders, each betting on a winner, each ensuring the war drags on. For civilians, this means the counteroffensive is not salvation. It is simply another chapter in a war prolonged by powers far beyond Sudan's borders. By 2025, Sudan is not one country. It is two fractured realities. In the east, the Sudanese armed forces hold Port Sudan and the corridor to Egypt. In the west, the rapid support forces dominate Darfur and parts of Kordofan. But maps cannot show the deeper truth. This is no longer just a war of armies. It is the systematic collapse of a nation. The United Nations calls Sudan the world's worst humanitarian crisis, a grim distinction in an era of global wars. 13 million people displaced, nearly 1 in 4 Sudanese, over half the population, more than 30 million, in desperate need of aid. The worst famine in 40 years, not caused by drought but by deliberate siege and starvation. Cities like El Fasher have endured more than a year of blockade. Families survive on animal feed. In Tawila, People scrape by with just 3 liters of water a day, less than half the emergency minimum. One aid worker summed it up: "There is no safe place left in Sudan." This is not only a hunger crisis, it is a war of atrocities. UN reports describe systematic war crimes: women abducted, raped, and enslaved, civilians executed in mass killings, mosques and camps bombed by drones. Darfur is once again a theater of ethnic cleansing, echoing the horrors of 20 years ago. Survivors of the earlier genocide now find themselves targeted again. Their camps burned, their communities shattered. In some areas, journalists and aid workers bring back stories of SAF counteroffensives, of people returning to Khartoum's ruins. In others, the war is hidden behind blackouts and blockades, with only shaky phone videos smuggled out. The result is a fractured picture. One Sudan limping back toward normalcy, another spiraling into starvation and despair. Efforts at peace come and go like desert winds. The Quad, US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE proposed humanitarian truces and transitions to civilian rule. But Sudanese civilians see these statements as paper promises, undermined by the same powers funding the war. The African Union and regional bodies pledge mediation, yet lack the leverage to force compliance. And the UN itself struggles, blocked by access denials, underfunded appeals, and the sovereignty arguments of men who would rather starve their people than lose ground. It leaves the war locked in a stalemate, each side too weak to win, too well-funded to lose. For civilians, politics is a luxury. Survival is the only measure. Mothers walk miles for food, only to return carrying children who died along the way. Camps that once held survivors of the Darfur genocide are bombed into dust. Families huddle in ruins, torn between the risk of staying and the dangers of fleeing. The war has become a daily, impossible choice: stay and risk bombardment, rape or starvation, flee and face abduction, execution, or disease. Both roads lead to death. Sudan's conflict is no longer about generals or even territory. It is about whether a people can endure the unendurable. The world looks away, distracted by louder wars. But Sudan's crisis is not lesser. It is simply quieter. And if it continues, it threatens not only Sudan, but all of East Africa. Refugees flooding into Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt. Arms smuggling, destabilizing fragile neighbors. Jihadist groups circling the chaos. Sudan's agony is already spilling beyond its borders. The Sudanese revolution once chanted, "Freedom, peace, justice." Now, those words echo like a memory, but history shows that voices cannot be silenced forever. From Darfur's camps to Port Sudan's ports, from Khartoum's rubble to the diaspora abroad, Sudanese civilians continue to speak. In protests, in testimonies, in whispered prayers, their demand is simple: that the world see them, that the war end, that Sudan, battered but unbroken, one day return to its people.